Hi everybody, I hope you're all well. And thank you for signing up to the Customer Service Practitioner Apprenticeship Standard webinar that we're delivering on behalf of Pearson. My name is Nathan Cookson. My role at Pearson is the Sector Manager for the Business, Technical and Professional sector. What that means is that I'm responsible at Pearson for the qualifications, apprenticeship and product strategy for the business, technical and professional sector. So that includes qualifications, it includes apprenticeships across sectors such as customer service, why we're here today, business administration, management and leadership, team leading, contact centers, sales and marketing, and financial services. So pretty much those sectors that cross all employers of all sizes. The webinar will take about an hour to deliver the content slide by slide. So the purpose of today really is to give you an introduction to the Customer Service Practitioner Standard, but I'm aware that there has been many webinars within the network around customer service and the apprenticeship standard already. So what we want to do here today at Pearson is to take that a bit further and to provide you with some additional content specifically around endpoint assessment and Pearson's approach to endpoint assessment. And what I'll also share with you today is some of the assessment tools that we will be using in regards to our endpoint assessment service, and those assessment tools that you can use with your apprentices during their on-program phase of the apprenticeship standard, but also to support them and prepare them for endpoint assessment. And at the end, just to kind of give you a flavour of Pearson's engagement with apprenticeship so far, and some of the large employers and providers we're working with to deliver endpoint assessment. So essentially to demonstrate that actually we've moved as an organisation away from just talking about the new apprenticeship standard. We're actually delivering endpoint assessments to this standard now, and we're learning as we go. So I don't want to focus on this slide too much. This is really just an overview of the changes between current SACE apprenticeship frameworks and new apprenticeship standards. And based on the earlier poll, this should all be content that you're familiar with. So on the left-hand side, what we see is existing SACE frameworks, which are still live and still available for apprenticeship registrations, primarily made of on-the-job and off-the-job training components, plus the mandated qualifications, typically an MVQ and a knowledge qualification. But as you're aware, in customer service, it's a combined diploma. We also have the PLTS and the ERR components of the SACE framework, all information that we know. The new apprenticeship standards, as you expect, are absolutely different, but some consistencies. Main difference being that they're developed solely by employers with the support of training providers, awarding organisations. And a good example there is that Pearson, we were kindly invited by the Apprenticeship Trailblazer Group for customer service to sit on their expert panel. So the standard you see in customer service practitioner at level 2 and level 3, Pearson, we've been directly involved in the development of that standard and assessment plan and supporting the employer group in that development. So the tools and resources that we talk about today, that they've been developed directly from the employer and provider feedback. Couple of differences, as you would expect. There's the on-program element to include your on-the-job and off-the-job training. As you probably know with customer service, there's no mandated qualifications, but we will come to that in a moment. There's the assessment gateway, critical phase of the apprenticeship program that also we'll talk about. And then potentially the biggest change is around this endpoint assessment phase once your apprentice progresses through the gateway. And that summative assessment, which is the very new element of new apprenticeship standards. So before we talk about the customer service standard, I just wanted to flag something to you all. Again, it may be content that you're already aware of, but SACE apprenticeship frameworks are in a phased withdrawal, and the department is issuing consultations as we speak now for a number of apprenticeship SACE frameworks in regards to their withdrawal. And what I wanted to flag to you today is that customer service level 2 and 3, the whole suite of management SACE, business and professional admin level 4, and the providing financial services standards at level 3 are all out for consultation in regards to that withdrawal. The consultation link is there. Unfortunately, it's closed. And we're waiting for an announcement from the department sometime this month to confirm whether indeed those SACE frameworks will be placed into a state of withdrawal, or whether they will essentially have a stay of execution for an extended period. Should the department, based on their feedback, confirm that these standards are placed in withdrawal, the proposed last date for new starts will be the 31st of March 2018. So really that's just to raise awareness to you that if you have not transitioned to the new apprenticeship standards as we speak, it's absolutely critical, if you are continuing to offer provision in the sector, to do so at the earliest opportunity. If the department decides not to put these standards out for withdrawal, then they will be on the next batch of proposed withdrawals. So it's essentially an inevitable situation, but it's just a flag to you that actually this is happening, and you do have an opportunity to feed your feedback to the department via the apprenticeship link, the withdrawal link within this slide. So I'm pleased to say that Pearson, we are on the Register of Apprenticeship Assessment Organisations. As it currently stands today, we have the most successful applications as a registered apprenticeship assessment organisation. We're here to talk about the Customer Service Practitioner Standard. However, I've just picked out 4 additional apprenticeship standards in the business sector that we're also approved to deliver endpoint assessment for, and the intention is that we run similar webinars to this to cover each of those sectors as and when we're in a position to provide you with some high quality content around those standards, as opposed to simply regurgitating which is in the assessment plan. What we'd like to do is provide you with information that's of real value to you in regards to your delivery. So moving on swiftly to Customer Service Practitioner level 2. So what we have here is essentially a summary of the level 2 apprenticeship standard. What you'll know is that with new apprenticeship standards, they're all written on a A4 piece of paper back to back. And within them, it contains the knowledge, skills, behaviours that an apprentice has to achieve during their on-programme and their endpoint assessment phase. You'll see for customer service, the minimum duration is 12 months. So apprentices have to be on programme for a minimum of 12 months before they can progress into endpoint assessment. And when it says entry requirements in the standard, what they mean there is that actually to pass, to achieve their apprenticeship standard, in addition to successfully progressing through endpoint assessment, the apprentice has to achieve a minimum of level 1 maths and English, which they may already possess, which if they do, that's great news. The caveat there is in the apprenticeship standard, it indicates that apprentices also must take a level 2 maths and English examination. So that's quite controversial. I don't have any more feedback in regards to what that means, but when we do, we will of course circulate that to you. But in regards to the parameters, it's a 12-month programme, and functional skills or GCSE level 1 maths and English is a mandatory requirement. Moving on then, supporting the apprenticeship standards is an assessment plan, and the employer group are tasked with creating the assessment plan at the same time or shortly after producing the apprenticeship standard. And what the assessment plan provides is the guidance for you as a employer or apprenticeship training provider in regards to how you deliver your on-programme learning, and in regards to the structure of your endpoint assessment. And we'll cover these components in more detail as we progress. But what you'll see during on-programme, and this diagram is lifted straight from the apprenticeship standard, and what you'll see is a 12-month minimum on-programme phase, and within the on-programme phase there will of course be on-the-job training, the requirement for 20% off-the-job training. This will all be supported by a robust programme of learning and development, and we anticipate that at this phase is where English and maths level 1 will be undertaken for those apprentices who do not already have that. The conversations we've been having with most employers is that the functional skills, or GCSE, in most cases functional skills, English and maths, will be front-ended within the programme to ensure that the apprentice has achieved that requirement prior to progressing to the next phase, which is the assessment gateway. And of course, the assessment gateway is a critical element of the apprenticeship program because it's essentially the decision point that can be as complex or as non-complex as you want to make it, or as your employers want to make it. But essentially, it's a point in the apprenticeship program where a decision is made in a conversation with the employer, the apprentice, and their apprenticeship training provider to make the decision that the apprentice can progress to endpoint assessment. A critical point there is that many employers I'm speaking to on a regular basis are using that assessment gateway period to prepare their apprentices for endpoint assessment. And the way they're doing this is essentially undertaking mock examinations, so mock professional discussions, mock practical observations. And a little bit of anecdotal evidence here is that one employer we're talking to is essentially implementing the assessment gateway at week 40 of their apprenticeship program, and then are allowing apprentices a 12-week window where they will undertake regular mock endpoint assessments to prepare that apprentice for the full endpoint assessment process. And I think that's good practice, not necessarily the week 40, because I think that's dependent upon the organisation, but the good practice is ensuring that the apprentice is prepared, confident, and ready for their endpoint assessment, because a confident and prepared apprentice is most likely to result in a successful outcome. So I've got to moving on to endpoint assessment, and we're going to cover this in more detail. We have three elements. We have an apprentice showcase, a practical observation, and a professional discussion. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about those three now because we have some dedicated slides to cover each of those three endpoint assessments. When your apprentice has successfully progressed and achieved those elements, they will then be certificated through the SFA, who will award a official apprenticeship certificate. At this point, it's also worth letting you know that the external quality organisation governing or regulating endpoint assessments within this standard, the employer group have chosen Ofqual to do that role, which is good news for ourselves because we see Ofqual as the highest level of quality assurance and regulation for endpoint assessment organisations. But what that does mean is that, and as communicated by Ofqual, is that they will expect that all endpoint assessment organisations adhere to their conditions of recognition. And that almost means that any organisation with an interest of endpoint assessment in the customer service standard will have to comply to the same guidance that an awarding organisation has to comply to. The employer group for customer service have been very kind. What they've also created to support the assessment plan and the apprenticeship standard is a customer service practitioner occupational brief. And they've written this brief to every single module and standard, the first two columns within the slide you can see of the apprenticeship standard. What the occupational brief is essentially what an apprentice needs to know, what they need to do, and what they need to show within their role. It's very much like amplification if you're used to qualification language. What they've also done is stipulate within the occupational brief the exact pass criteria and the distinction criteria that an apprentice will have to meet during endpoint assessment, in addition to the method of assessment that those pass criteria and distinction criteria relate to. So the slide you've got here is, for example, understand who customers are, number one. They've identified the pass criteria, they've identified the distinction criteria, and they've identified that this will be assessed during endpoint assessment by a professional discussion. What that means is that it's created a standardized approach that all endpoint assessment organizations will be following, which is good news because you'll be familiar with some standards that have only listed the modules and standard and have not articulated that pass and distinction criteria, which means that it's down to the endpoint assessment organisation to do that, and which could create some issues in the immediate future around standardisation. Just something I wanted to flag here, specifically in the difference between SACE and the new standard, is that you will see when looking at the what do I need to know, it's very much centric around the apprentice. So who are my customers, who are the organisation's customers, and describe the different types of customers. So it's asking around how customer service applies to the apprentice's organisation. So it's reinforcing that context, that employer context. Whereas the SACE standard, I would conclude, is more around the underpinning knowledge and skills around customer service, whereas the new standards really take that a step further and contextualize and look for evidence around the application to the apprentices organisation. And we think that's a good thing. And that was something that the employer group were very strong about when they were developing this customer service occupational brief. So how the grading works for the customer service standard, because there has been some questions in the network around this, and I think sitting on the employer group here allows us to kind of give you that clarification around how the grading will work. So in regards to the endpoint assessment, there are 3 components, as already discussed: an apprentice showcase, an observation, and a professional discussion. To pass the apprenticeship, your apprentice will have to hit all of the pass criteria for each of these 3 assessment methods. So to pass the apprenticeship, they have to achieve 100% of all the pass criteria, which was in the grading criteria in the previous slide. So that's the pass. In regards to the distinction, for the apprentice showcase, the apprentice has to hit a minimum of 70% of the distinction criteria for the apprentice showcase. So there's 10 distinction criteria within the apprentice showcase. They'll have to hit a minimum of 7 to get a distinction in that element. And then using that pattern on the next couple, the observation, it's 80%. So there's 5 distinction criteria in the observation phase. So the apprentice has to hit a minimum of 4 of those. And then moving on to the professional discussion, it's 75% of the minimum distinction criteria in relation to the professional discussion. So 3 out of 4. So it's quite an intensive endpoint assessment with a lot of pass criteria and a significant volume of distinction criteria. And again, that was purposely done by the employer group with their aim to raise the standard and the perception of customer service apprenticeships within the network. So something that we kind of alluded to in an earlier slide is qualifications to support on program. So what you'll see in the customer service standard, with the exception of maths and English, is that there's no mandated qualification within the apprenticeship standard. What I would like to say there, and kind of the evidence that I can reflect back to sitting on this specific employer group and other employer groups, is that just because there is no mandated qualification in the standard, please don't think that means that employers and learners and the parents of learners don't want qualifications. The decision for a qualification is often driven by at the time the department who make that choice, and the guidance there is that if it's not mandatory for an apprentice to have a qualification to progress within the sector, or to progress within a professional organisation supporting the sector, or a license to practice, then it cannot be mandated. And the argument is that an apprentice does not need a mandatory qualification in customer service to progress in the sector. But just to reinforce that employers, based on my anecdotal evidence and some of our evidence, is that they do value qualifications, but it's really in your gift as an apprenticeship training provider and an employer to whether you embed a qualification in delivery. What we've done at Pearson here is that we've mapped the existing level 2 diploma in customer service against the current apprenticeship standard to identify coverage of how that apprenticeship and the current level 2 diploma in customer service maps to that standard, so that should you choose to, you can use that qualification almost as a vehicle to support a program of teaching and learning during that on-program phase. But just to be clear, it's not a mandated requirement. One of the benefits, of course, to using a qualification is that additional recognition, but looking at functional skills for intended, a qualification, and endpoint assessment, you can put in place a phase recognition to keep the apprentice engaged and to recognise their success during the full apprenticeship programme. A really critical piece of information, if an apprenticeship standard doesn't include a qualification, then the funding, so the levy funding or the 10% contribution or the remaining 90% cannot be used to cover the registration, examination and certification costs against the apprenticeship standard. However, the funding can be used where the teaching and learning content clearly overlaps between the apprenticeship training, the on-programme element, and also the qualification. Employers will need to cover the costs of registration, examination and certification for where a qualification is not mandated, or for elements of the qualification that doesn't overlap the apprenticeship standard. So reinforce there, you cannot use funding to cover registration, certification, examination fees where the qualification is not mandated, but of course you can use it to cover training, teaching and learning where that content overlaps. And to support you in identifying that content, Pearson has produced very detailed mapping against the existing qualification and the new apprenticeship standard, and that mapping is available to download from our new apprenticeship area of the website. All you'll need to do is just enter your Edexcel online credentials to access that mapping. Alternatively, if there's difficulties, please do contact Pearson or your account manager, and we can share that mapping with you. Just to advise that Pearson, we are not developing a qualification that entirely maps across to the qualification, to the new apprenticeship standard. Couple of reasons for that being the current standard maps in a great amount of detail, and we're absolutely aware that this qualification is only less than 3 years old, and the feedback we've had from organisations is, one, it's still relevant, and two, some of the teaching and learning materials you've created for that qualification can be recycled and reused. The third point, which was raised to me recently by an apprenticeship training provider, is it potentially creates a conflict of interest to develop a 100% aligned qualification, because what if you have a situation where your apprentice achieves the qualification during on program phase, which is mapped 100% to the apprenticeship, but does not pass endpoint assessment? So it has the potential to create, we think, an unnecessary conflict of interest, specifically when the current standard does more than a good job already. So we spoke about this earlier in one of the earlier slides, was around the assessment gateway. And what I do say there, and I'll reinforce it, is it can be as simple or as complicated as it needs to be. Obviously simple the better, but what it is, it's a window, a checklist, a gate within the apprenticeship program after 12 months, where the employer, the apprentice, and their training provider or assessor or FE college make a recommendation and a decision that an apprentice is ready to progress to endpoint assessment. And as we discussed, Pearson will provide a checklist and a gateway declaration form that you can use to formalize that process, and that we can receive to know that your apprentice is ready for endpoint assessment. So moving on to endpoint assessment, what we've created here at Pearson in regards to endpoint assessment is a endpoint assessment specification document, and this is ready and can be shared by your account manager with you now. What the endpoint specification does, it articulates the apprenticeship standard and Pearson's approach to endpoint assessment, and includes all of the assessment and support resources and tools that you will need to prepare your apprentice for endpoint assessment and for your apprentice to progress through endpoint assessment. For each of the 3 assessment components, so the apprentice showcase, the observation and the professional discussion, there are 4 main elements of the endpoint assessment specification. The first element is the apprenticeship standard. So what we've done is clearly break down which elements or modules of the apprenticeship standard are assessed by, for example, the apprentice showcase. So what are the skills, knowledge and behaviours being assessed by the apprentice showcase, for example? Alongside that, we've also created teaching and learning content to support each of the three assessment methods. And a good example there is, if you're familiar with a qualification and Pearson's approach, we create detailed content and detailed teaching and learning amplification, or content that underpins the standard outcomes. So we've written that content against each of the modules that are assigned to the three assessment approaches, very much, like I said, like a qualification amplification. Third element is assessment delivery. So what are the rules governing each of the three assessment methods? So what we've done is clearly articulate the rules around the apprentice showcase. So how will it be delivered? How will it be assessed? And that includes a detailed assessment brief that we'll cover shortly around the apprentice showcase. And also, how should an observation and professional discussion take place? Where should it take place? How long should it last? Those sort of questions and that sort of guidance is answered in the Pearson Endpoint Assessment specification. And then finally, we have the detailed grading criteria to support each of those three assessment approaches to support you and your apprentice in identifying what evidence they need to prepare and to achieve to reach a pass and to reach a distinction. And what you can do, you can share this endpoint specification at the front end of your apprenticeship program in order to prepare your apprentice as early as possible. So what I wanted to do today is to provide more information than just talking about what an apprentice showcase is and what the grading criteria is. I wanted to go into a little bit more detail around Pearson's approach to endpoint assessment and the tools we've created to support you. So just to summarise, the first assessment component is the apprentice showcase. And the apprentice showcase is compiled after 12 months of on-programme learning and is a summative portfolio in which apprentices will demonstrate the support with the support of work-based evidence, how they've used and applied the knowledge, skills and behaviours during their on-programme phase and in their everyday work practice. To set the context there, what the employer group actually wanted was for a apprentice to produce a portfolio on programme and lift that portfolio into endpoint assessment to be assessed by the endpoint assessor. That's not allowed, that wasn't allowed, and the department would not approve recycling a portfolio. So what the employer group have created is an apprentice showcase, which is a reflective summary. So how we anticipate this work is that, of course, your apprentices will produce a portfolio over a period of time during on programme, but what they'll do their apprentice showcase is produce an additional bit of evidence and reflect on what they've done during the on programme phase and draw across their best pieces of evidence in a summative way during the endpoint assessment phase. And in regards to how that's going to work, because all endpoint assessment organisations have been tasked with creating an assessment brief, or think an assignment brief, but not a FE type assignment, and an assessment brief in regards to supporting the apprentice in creating their apprentice showcase. To give you an understanding of the size of the apprentice showcase, there's 30 pass criteria and 10 distinction criteria within the apprentice showcase. So it's the largest element of endpoint assessment, and it equates to about 65% of the total apprenticeship standard in regards to criteria. Pearson, we've produced a assessment brief and it's included within the apprenticeship endpoint assessment specification. And that's ready for you to view now. And in essence, you can start preparing your apprentices and familiarise them with that apprentices at any point during their on-programme phase. Within the assessment brief, we've broken down those 30 pass criteria and 10 distinction criteria into 3 clear tasks. Task 1 and Task 2 requires the apprentice to produce evidence around understanding their organisation and understanding their roles and responsibilities within their organisation. These are pretty much linked directly to the knowledge criteria within the apprenticeship standard. The third task is around reflecting on their own practice. And task 3 is really the element of the apprentice showcase where the apprentice will draw and reflect on the evidence they've produced on program, and reflect and draw some of that evidence they produce on their on program portfolio. A couple of other bullet points. Of course, there has to be some assessment parameters around the apprentice showcase, specifically as it's being governed as the EQA organisation by Ofqual. We anticipate that the apprentice showcase will take approximately 8 hours to complete, to formulate. And when we say 8 hours, it's not prescriptive in regards that it has to be bang on 8 hours. But what it does mean is that there'll be a period of supervised and non-supervised conditions in regards to the apprentice showcase. And to extrapolate that further, when I say non-supervised conditions, the apprentice showcase does not have to be completed in the workplace. The apprentice can absolutely take that home, go into a quiet room and work on their apprentice showcase. But what we've built into the assessment method is that the final 2 hours of this approximate 8 hours has to be under supervised conditions. And the reason why we've stipulated that is really around authenticity, and to ensure that actually this apprentice showcase that the apprentices produce is of their own work. And when I say supervised conditions, that can be done singularly, or it can be done in a cohort of learners that are supported by their employer and their apprenticeship training provider. At the same time, Pearson, in regards to endpoint assessment, we're not going to stipulate that the entire endpoint assessment process has to be done virtually or digital first. We're also not going to stipulate that it has to be done face-to-face. What we're going to stipulate is that it's customer choice, and we are happy to be flexible with our endpoint assessment in regards to the needs of your apprentice. And a good example there is the last bullet point where it says apprentices have the option of submission through a presentation. What we mean there actually is if your apprentice is a great apprentice, because I'm sure they are, but are also fabulous at articulating their point and getting their point across, it may be advantageous to them that they do a presentation to the endpoint assessor. However, another example, if your apprentice is not as competent at face-to-face presentations, they may want to submit their apprentice showcase virtually or electronically. So what we're saying there is please use the apprentice showcase and the method to the advantage of the apprentice to get the best out of what they can produce. One final point there is that if your apprentice does choose to present face-to-face to an apprentice, to the endpoint assessor, unfortunately the endpoint assessor will not be able to probe or ask questions around that presentation. The reason being is because we have to ensure as an endpoint assessment organisation that the apprentice has the same chance and has the same opportunity to present evidence to their endpoint assessor. So the example is if the apprentice submits electronically, they won't get further questioned by the endpoint assessor. We anticipate on most cases that apprentices will choose to submit electronically or in a hard copy to their endpoint assessor, but just to reinforce that it's open and it's down to customer choice. Moving on to the observation. So the observation is a pre-planned and scheduled observation when the apprentice will be in their normal place of work, and it will be carried out by the independent assessor. So the independent assessor will be observing your apprentice in their place of work. Again, 25 pass criteria and 5 distinction criteria. So it's a significant piece of evidence and a significant element of endpoint assessment. So your apprentices will be observed in their normal work environment, interacting with at least 2 customers in regards to delivery of customer service in a non-face-to-face or a face-to-face environment. The reason why there has to be 2 customers is because it's written in the assessment plan around the grading criteria that a apprentice adapts their communication to different customers. So that's one of the reasons why it has to be a minimum of 2 customers. But we anticipate there won't be any issues there, because apprentices will be delivering, we imagine, to a number of different customers during that observation phase. It will last for approximately 1 hour period. Again, similarly to the showcase, we are flexible. If the presence of an endpoint assessor has the potential to become obtrusive, then the observation can be done at distance using video technology. So again, we're being flexible in regards to our method of endpoint assessment. However, we anticipate in most cases this will be a face-to-face observation with the endpoint assessor and the apprentice. What's become apparent is, and what we know is that actually in observations, what if the apprentice doesn't get the opportunity at no fault of their own to demonstrate some of the criteria that they have to meet within the observation? What will happen there is there'll be the opportunity at the end of the observation for the apprentice to provide real work-based evidence to their endpoint assessor. So the endpoint assessor will communicate to the apprentice the outcomes of the observation, but also that unfortunately you didn't get the opportunity to demonstrate these pass or distinction criteria. Can you provide some evidence of how you've done that in the past? The beauty here is that we've linked that potential evidence to the apprentice showcase so that it's not labour intensive and the apprentice doesn't have to produce more evidence that they haven't already produced within their EPA period. So moving on to the final element of endpoint assessment, the professional discussion. So the professional discussion is a structured discussion between the apprentice and the endpoint assessor following the observation. And the key words there are a structured discussion. So what we're familiar with a professional discussion is a discussion essentially which is in most cases led by the apprentice. However, whilst the employer group called this a professional discussion, it is more like a structured discussion. And when I say a structured discussion, the apprentices will be asked a series of questions by the independent endpoint assessor that are based on the criteria, the pass and distinction criteria within the apprenticeship standard. It has to be done this way is because within the professional discussion, we need to ensure that all apprentices have the option and the ability to present to or to discuss with their endpoint assessor and present the evidence they need to present. So the only way really to do that is to structure that professional discussion with a series of questions. So the endpoint assessor will have those questions. If the professional discussion covers those questions as they go, they obviously won't go back to the ones that are already completed, but it's there almost as an assessor reference document to ensure that the apprentice has the ability to demonstrate the evidence they need to, and that all apprentices have that same ability to do so. Within the professional discussion, apprentices will be required to provide real-life examples of how they've applied knowledge, understanding to their job role. Again, so this goes back to where we shared earlier, how the apprenticeship standards has changed from simply understanding customer service and delivering customer service to application and context to the organisation that the apprentice works with. The professional discussion will take roughly about 1 hour, and again it can be conducted face-to-face or it can be conducted via technology. So endpoint assessment delivery models. The assessment plan clearly defines who an independent assessor is. And essentially what that means is the independent assessor has to have no involvement with the apprentice at all. They are commissioned, or I guess not necessarily owned, but the responsibility of the endpoint assessment organisation. They don't have to hold an assessor and verifier award according to the apprenticeship standard, the assessment plan, but they do need to have experience of assessment and verification decisions. Just to point out that for Pearson endpoint assessors, we would expect that our endpoint assessors do have the appropriate assessor and verifier award. At the same time, they also have to have a minimum of 2 years current occupational competence to be an endpoint assessor. What I wanted to share here is the methods or delivery methods of endpoint assessment. And Pearson, we've had detailed conversations with the department around actually how can endpoint assessment work and how can it be delivered. And we've identified two models. The first model being the one I think we all understand, which is direct delivery. And what I mean by direct delivery is that as an apprenticeship training organisation and crucially as an employer, you will be able to procure an endpoint assessment service from an endpoint assessment organisation such as Pearson, and that endpoint assessor will undertake the full endpoint assessment service for your apprentice. Very straightforward and what we all understand around endpoint assessment. The second conversation we've had with the department is around partnership delivery, and actually how can the existing employer and apprenticeship training provider network, that assessor resource, be used to deliver endpoint assessment. What the department has said to us is that we cannot delegate endpoint assessment completely to for example, a training provider to deliver themselves. So think the way a qualification is delivered and standards verified. That's not possible and is not allowed. So I'll be very just be cautious if any organisation is saying that's feasible, because we have the evidence from the SFA that it's not. But what can happen is that an endpoint assessment organisation can subcontract the endpoint assessment, the physical assessment, to another organisation to deliver the endpoint assessment. However, Pearson or the endpoint assessment organisation would still be accountable for that individual. They would still be accountable for their assessment decisions. They will still be accountable for the training, standardisation, ongoing CPD, etc. And Pearson, if undertaking a partnership approach with an organisation, would still be responsible for the quality assurance of those assessment decisions. So it's quite confusing and it's quite grey. But there's 2 points to take around that partnership delivery. If, for an example, you are a apprenticeship training provider or employer, and you want to use your own assessors to deliver endpoint assessment through Pearson as an endpoint assessment organisation. Firstly, those assessors cannot be linked to any of the on-programme delivery of that apprentice at all. So there's no conflict of interest. That's quite clear. The second point, and the bit that I think a lot of organisations are not aware of and are stipulated by the department, in this model, those assessors would have to be employed within a separate organisation or a separate legal entity to that training apprenticeship training provider or employer. The example there is, say you had Joe Bloggs's on-programme training service. What Joe Bloggs training service would also have to have in this case is a separate legal entity called Joe Bloggs Assessment Services in order for that partnership approach to work. So it's quite complex. The first model is not complex, direct delivery. That's about procuring endpoint assessment. The second model, partnership delivery, is around working together in partnerships or consortiums to use your assessor resources to deliver endpoint assessment. But please be aware of the 2 considerations. Assessors can't be linked to on-programme delivery, and assessors must be employed within a separate organisation or a separate legal business entity for that to happen. In regards to pricing, so based on the delivery models, we've come up with 2 prices. For direct delivery, so the endpoint assessment process that we're all familiar with, it will be £550 for customer service level 2. What that £550 includes is full registration certification to the qualification as well. So for £550, you'll have access to full endpoint assessment and to the BTEC level 2 diploma in customer service. The beauty of that approach is that there's no fee for the qualification registration in regards to that. So going back to the slide around funding, the cost for Pearson endpoint assessment is £550. Whether you choose to adopt the qualification or not, the cost for endpoint assessment is still £550. The qualification is embedded into that £550 at no additional cost. We'll also bundle in our functional skills English and maths offer into that at additional £27.80. So I just want to talk through the registration process for endpoint assessment using the diagram we spoke about at the beginning. So what will happen is at the onset of your program, we anticipate there will be a signed letter of intent, or essentially a contract, not a formal contract, but a letter of intent that determines that yes, we've agreed to work together for endpoint assessment. This is how many apprentices there'll be, and this is the fee for endpoint assessment. And that will be agreed at the onset of the apprenticeship program. At the start of on program, your apprentices or you will register your apprentices to Edexcel Online. The purpose here is that so that we can see very early within the apprenticeship program your pipeline of apprentices, and what this does, this allows for Pearson to plan and ensure that endpoint assessor resources are in place. To confirm and to answer one of the questions, at the point of registration, there will be a £100 charge for endpoint assessment, but this £100 will come off the overall endpoint assessment fee. And it's at this point where you'll have access to the qualification registration and App 360 resources when they are ready to share. In regards to SLAs, we anticipate and we're communicating that you will book your endpoint assessment 2 months before your EPA, your endpoint assessment, is due, using the registration you'd previously make. So what this essentially means is that you're indicating within your registration the dates at which your endpoint assessment for your apprentice should be taking place. When we know this, your independent endpoint assessor will contact you, your employer or your apprenticeship training provider, to arrange a planning meeting to prepare for endpoint assessment. This can be done on an individual one-to-one apprentice basis, or it can be done to apply to cohorts of apprentice. But essentially, this is around making the arrangements for endpoint assessment. At this point, we anticipate it's where you will submit your EPA readiness form and the gateway evidence and supply this to your endpoint assessor so they know that endpoint assessment is absolutely taking place. The endpoint assessor will check the gateway evidence and they will undertake endpoint assessment as agreed on the dates and as agreed during the planning discussion. On successful completion of endpoint assessment, the grade and the calculations will be entered into Edexcel Online, and the endpoint assessor will be able to communicate the outcome of endpoint assessment to your apprentices. Upon a successful outcome, we will then progress with certification. Should a resit be required, then this will be communicated and planned through your endpoint assessor. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up with the final couple of slides. I don't want to focus too much on this, but this is essentially why I work with Pearson on the new apprenticeship standards. So just to clarify that, as you know, as a Pearson organisation, we deliver apprenticeships in over 35 sectors. We sit on a number of the endpoint assessment employer groups. So we sit on a number of employer groups. So for example, I sit on the customer service group supporting the employers. Pearson, we also sit on the management and leadership group, and we sit on those employer groups as an employer, as a levy paying employer with in-house apprentices, and we also sit on those employer groups as a endpoint assessment organisation offering support to employers, and of course as an awarding organisation. And what that does allow us to do is to contextualise our resources to what the employers are asking for, but also as part of our service to provide you with that first-hand evidence that's feeding directly from the employer group, as opposed to regurgitating simply what's in an apprenticeship standard, and we think that's really important. And just again, a good example of how Pearson now we were at a stage of implementation of endpoint assessment, as opposed to still talking conceptually. We are delivering For example, to British Gas, we were successful in a procurement contract to deliver endpoint assessments for two key standards: customer service practitioner and smart meter installer. So we're already in the process of delivering endpoint assessments for smart meter. They commenced in April 2017, and we've learned a lot from them at those assessments that we're taking forward into customer service, and we commence our customer service endpoint assessments in 2017 in September. So it's an exciting time for us, and we're gearing up to do that. We're looking at around about 2,500 to 3,000 endpoint assessments over the next 3 to 5 years for customer service. So it gives a good indication of the size of this standard, and also reinforces why it's important to be having those early conversations around planning of pipeline, but also why we think engaging in partnership discussions are equally as important. And just to give you an update on another couple of standards that you might not be familiar with, you obviously know that the team leading and the level 5 ops manager standards are submitted and ready for delivery, and we'll be delivering a webinar against those in due course. Two you may not be as familiar with. So customer service level 3, the standard is approved. The assessment plan has been submitted to the department for approval. We've had a response that there needs to be some further work. So the employer group, and supported by ourselves, are refining that assessment plan. But just to identify, it's an approximately 15 months program that includes a work-based project, a presentation, and a reflective log. Business administration. So the standard has been approved since May 2006, but there's been some back and forward to and throwing with the department around the assessment plan, which has still not been approved. However, it's approximately 12 to 18 months and includes a knowledge test, a portfolio interview, and a product stroke improvement presentation. One of the reasons for the delay for both standard is that there's been a challenge on funding. And when we have feedback on both standards in regards to approval and ready for delivery, we'll of course let you know from employers to do so. A separate employer group was set up, led by Skills for Health and a number of NHS trusts. Thank you very much for dialing into this webinar, and hopefully you found it useful.